The envelope had been sitting on the kitchen table for 11 days. Jesse Calloway had moved it twice. Once to the counter so she would not have to look at it during breakfast, and once back to the table because the counter made it worse somehow, like the envelope had followed her and was waiting to be acknowledged. $67,420. That was the number inside. Not a round number, not a clean break. The kind of number that came from months of small disasters stacked on top of each other, like plates no one was strong enough to carry, but no one could set down either. She stood at the kitchen window with a mug of coffee gone cold between her hands and watched the sky change color over the tree line. Vermont in late January did not ease into storms. It committed to them. The clouds coming in from the northwest were the gray of old iron, low and fast, pressing the light out of the afternoon before 4 o'clock. The forecast had said 8 to 14 inches. Jesse had learned long ago that forecasts in iron mills usually meant double. The house around her was quiet in the way old houses were quiet when they had been full once and were not anymore. Ray Calloway had built this kitchen table himself from a piece of white oak salvaged from a barn 2 towns over. He had sanded it by hand over 3 weekends while Jesse sat on the back porch at age 9 and handed him sandpaper sheets when he asked. She remembered the sound of it, the long pull of grit across grain, the way the wood changed smell as the surface opened. She remembered asking him why he did not just buy a table, and he had said because a bought table has no memory of your hands, which she had not understood at 9 and understood completely now. The table had taken weight since then, homework and arguments and Sunday dinners, and now a hospital bill that wanted to eat the whole house from the foundation up. Jesse set the mug down and pulled the envelope open for the 3rd time, though she had memorized every line of it. Mercy Regional Medical Center, patient Diana Calloway, balance due following insurance adjustment. She had been over the itemized list so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. Every line made sense in the way that pointless things sometimes made sense. Oxygen, IV antibiotics, oncology consultation, radiation planning. Things that had kept her mother alive and were now threatening to take everything else. Diana Calloway was 51 years old and had been diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer 7 months ago. She was 3 rounds into a 6-round treatment plan and doing better than the statistics said she should, which Jesse took as a form of stubbornness she had inherited from the right person. Diana had worked as a school librarian for 18 years, which meant she had good insurance by the standards of women who worked jobs they loved instead of jobs that paid well. Good insurance turned out to mean something different when the bills actually arrived. The co-pays alone had eaten through the savings account by October. The insurance gap, the difference between what the policy said it would cover and what it actually covered once the deductibles and the out-of-network consultations and the imaging center billing quirks were accounted for, had produced the number in the envelope. The hospital had been patient. Jesse would give them that. 2 payment plans had been negotiated and broken, not from dishonesty, but from math that kept not working out. Tips from the diner covered groceries and the truck payment and the minimum on her mother's Medicare supplement and the electric bill and the oil for the furnace. They did not cover $67,000, and no arrangement of those facts produced a different answer, no matter how many times Jesse ran the numbers at this table in the early morning before anyone else was awake. Frank Greer had called on a Tuesday 3 weeks ago. His voice on the phone was the kind of smooth that took years of practice, warm without being warm, helpful without helping. He said he had heard about her situation through the county property office, which Jesse later understood meant he had paid attention to public filings in the same way a hawk paid attention to a field. He said he had a proposal that might solve her immediate problem. He said the word immediate like he was doing her a favor by noticing she had one. The proposal was this. He would purchase the Calloway property at 4 Ridgeline Road, Iron Mills, Vermont, for $85,000, enough to clear the hospital debt, and leave Jesse approximately $17,000 to relocate and reestablish herself somewhere more manageable. The word manageable had done something to Jesse's jaw that she had to actively work against. The house sat on 4 acres or so. The most recent paperwork showed with road frontage and a creek-fed back pasture and had been in the Calloway name since 1987. It was not manageable. It was the only place on earth where she still felt like Ray Calloway's daughter instead of just a woman trying to survive a sequence of losses. She had asked for a week to think about it. Frank Greer had given her 10 days with the kind of generosity that came with an expiration date. Tomorrow was the 10th day. 3 weeks ago, before Greer's call before the 10-day clock had started, Jesse had gone to the county branch of the bank on Main Street to ask about refinancing options. It had been an act of structured desperation, the kind where you already know the answer is no, but you need to have asked so you can say you tried everything. The woman who helped her had careful posture and a name tag that said Lena. She was perhaps 30, dark-haired, the kind of quietly competent that came from years of managing difficult conversations with a professional face. Lena had pulled up the property file and gone through the numbers with the efficiency of someone who had done this kind of conversation many times. She explained the refinancing options that were not available because the existing mortgage had already been extended once, and the equity position given the outstanding balance did not support a second instrument at the amount needed. She explained these things clearly and without condescension. Jesse had appreciated the clarity even as it closed every door it opened. But at one point, while scrolling through the county records on her screen, Lena had paused. It was not a long pause. 2 seconds, perhaps 3. She had looked at the acreage listed for the Callaway property, then looked at it again, and then looked at Jesse with an expression that lasted only a moment before she smoothed it back into the neutral professional register she had been holding the whole conversation. Jesse had noticed it. She had filed it in the part of her mind that held things she did not yet have categories for, and driven home and spent 4 hours at this table trying to make the math work in a different configuration. The math had not worked. The expression on Lena's face had stayed at the edge of her memory unresolved the way small things stayed when they were waiting for context. Now Jesse folded the bank envelope and set it beside the sugar bowl, which still had the small ceramic rooster on the lid that her mother had bought at a craft fair the summer Jesse was 12. She picked up the stack of papers she had pulled from the file cabinet in her father's old office, the one off the back hallway that still smelled faintly of motor oil, and the cedar blocks he used to keep moths out of his riding gear. She had been going through the papers for 3 nights now, looking for anything that might change the math. Insurance documents, mortgage records. The title to the truck her father had never finished restoring, the one that sat under a tarp in the garage wearing a layer of dust that had become structural. A file folder labeled simply MESC that contained a grocery list from 2019, a church bulletin, 2 birthday cards in her own child's handwriting, and a photograph she had not seen before. The photograph showed her father standing beside a man she did not recognize. Both of them were in riding gear iron veil patches on their vests, standing in front of a gas station, somewhere flat and sun-baked, that was not Vermont. Her father was laughing. Not smiling, actually laughing, head back and eyes crinkled the way he laughed at things that genuinely surprised him. The other man was taller, dark-haired, going gray at the temples, with a look on his face like he had just said whatever it was that made Ray laugh. On the back of the photograph in her father's handwriting were 4 words: Rook, brother, best kind. Jessie had set the photograph on the table and looked at it for a long time. Then she had put it in the stack with everything else and not let herself think about what best kind meant when it was written by a man she had spent 4 years being angry at. Ray Calloway had died on a March morning 4 years ago when his motorcycle left Route 9 and went down an embankment into a tree line. The investigating officer had listed road conditions and excessive speed as contributing factors. The funeral had been attended by 40-some members of Iron Veil MC men in leather, who stood at the back of the church and held their helmets in front of them with both hands and did not speak unless spoken to. Jessie had stood beside her mother at the graveside and felt the distance between herself and those men. Like a physical thing, a cold gap she had no desire to cross. She had thanked them when they filed past. She had not invited them to the house afterward. Iron Veil had sent money, twice, once right after the funeral and once 6 months later with a card signed by a dozen names. Jessie had cashed the checks because she was not in a position to be proud about it, but she had not called to say thank you, and she had not opened the door when 2 of them came by on a Sunday afternoon in July. She had watched from the upstairs window until they left. Her mother had said nothing about it, which meant Diana understood something Jessie was not ready to understand yet. What Jessie knew about her father's death was what the official report said. What she suspected but could never prove was something heavier and older than a police report, a feeling she had carried without ever giving it a name, that the road on Route 9 on a dry morning in March did not take experienced riders by accident. But suspicion without evidence was just grief looking for somewhere to put itself, And she had learned the hard way that pursuing that particular door led nowhere except further away from the life that still needed living. She carried the stack of papers to the fireplace in the front room because the filing cabinet needed to go with the house sale, and she did not want Frank Greer's people sorting through her father's grocery lists and birthday cards. She laid a bed of newspaper in the grate the way her grandmother had shown her, small pieces twisted tight, and set two pieces of split oak on top. She lit the match and watched the paper catch. Orange light moved across the floor. Outside, the first serious snow began to come down. She was feeding the papers and slowly watching the birthday cards curl and blacken at the edges when she picked up the grocery list and turned it over out of habit before she burned it. The back was not blank. There was handwriting on it, small and careful, not a grocery list at all, but a series of numbers and a date. Below the numbers, a line that read Greer R. 2019, original on file County Clerk, March 14th. Below that, a notation that said, copy in box Rook holds. Jessie stared at it. The fire popped, and a piece of burning paper lifted on the heat and drifted toward the grate screen. She caught it without thinking and held the grocery list in both hands and read it again. She did not know what the numbers meant. She did not know what the original referred to. She did not understand the phrase county clerk in the context of whatever her father had been writing down. But she understood that her father had written Frank Greer's name on a piece of paper he had intended to keep, that he had dated it, and that he had noted a copy held by someone called Rook. And she thought about the pause on Lena's face when she had looked at the county records on her screen. She sat down on the floor in front of the fire with the paper in her hands and the rest of the stack still waiting beside her, and she stayed there long enough for the logs to settle into coals, while the snow outside went from light to serious, to the kind that meant the night had decided to become something else entirely. The knock came at 9:15. Jessie had not heard an engine over the wind, which had been building for the past hour, into the steady compression she associated with storms that intended to stay a while. The knock was heavy, not frantic, the knock of someone who was cold, but not panicking. She stood up from where she had been sitting at the kitchen table with the grocery list in front of her and a glass of water she had not drunk, and she did not move toward the door. The knock came again. 3 beats. Deliberate. She went to the window beside the door and pulled the curtain edge aside with one finger. The porch light was on, a motion-activated light her father had installed the year she turned 15. In the cone of yellow light through snow, coming sideways, she could make out shapes, not one shape, several. Large shapes in heavy jackets, snow already thick on their shoulders, motorcycles visible at the edge of the light, where they had been walked rather than ridden up the drive. She could see the vests even through the snow. The iron veil patch was not subtle. 2 crossed black wings over a shield, the kind of design that was meant to be seen from a distance, so that whatever was coming knew what it was dealing with. Jessie counted 4 men on the porch and at least 2 more at the edge of the drive. Behind them, dark shapes that resolved into more motorcycles as her eyes adjusted, pulled tight against the fence where the snow had not yet drifted deep. A man in front raised his hand and knocked again. Not harder, just patient. She stepped back from the window. Her heart was doing something specific and unpleasant that she recognized as not entirely fear. There was something else in it, a recognition she did not want to have, because recognition meant engagement, and engagement meant opening a door she had kept closed for 4 years. She went to the closet by the back door and found the flashlight her father had kept there, heavy-handled and bright. She checked the locks on the back door by touch. Then she went back to the front window and looked again. One of the men near the edge of the group had sat down in the snow against the porch railing. He was not sitting the way someone sat when they were waiting. He was sitting the way someone sat when they did not have much choice about it. Even from inside, through glass and weather, she could see the wrong color in his face. His skin had gone the particular gray that skin went when the body was conserving everything it had for the work of continuing. Jessie stood with her hand on the deadbolt and her forehead against the cold wood of the door, and made a decision that she could feel herself making a conscious thing, a choice rather than a reaction, which is the only way she could live with it afterward. She opened the door. The wind came in first, carrying snow and the smell of cold leather and exhaust and the metallic edge of a serious winter night. The man in front was tall, broader than the doorframe wanted to accommodate, with a dark beard, edged white by frost, and eyes that were tired but completely present. He did not step forward. He looked at her the way a man looked when he had been told to be careful with something and intended to be. "My name is Caleb Maddox," he said. "Folks call me Rook. We were heading north on 9 when Bobby went down. His heart does this sometimes. We need to get him warm, and we need about an hour for his medication to work, and then we will be gone. We have a first aid kit and we have everything we need. We are not asking for anything except to be out of that wind. Jesse looked past him to the man sitting in the snow. Bobby was perhaps 60, gray-haired, his face the wrong color, even in the poor light, one gloved hand pressed flat against his sternum in the universal language of a heart that was misbehaving. She looked back at Caleb Maddox. She said, "I know who you are." He looked at her steadily. He did not ask how. "You are the one my father called best kind," she said. And then, because she had made her decision and intended to own it, bring him inside. The order of things after that, it was precise in a way that surprised her. Caleb did not come in immediately. He turned and spoke to the men behind him in a voice too low for her to catch every word, and what followed was a kind of organized entry she had not expected. Two men came in, supporting Bobby between them, moving directly to the couch she pointed to in the front room without touching anything else. A third man followed, carrying a hard-sided first aid case and a small oxygen concentrator in a canvas bag, the kind designed for long-distance riding. The rest stayed on the porch or at the edge of the drive without being asked to. Caleb came in last. He stopped in the entry and looked at the floor, then down at his boots, which were carrying half the driveway in snow. "May I?" he said, indicating the boot mat. She nodded. He sat on the entry bench and unlaced his boots without ceremony. Behind him, the two men who had brought Bobby in were already doing the same. The man with the first aid kit had set it open on the coffee table and was checking Bobby's pulse with practiced efficiency, a small pulse oximeter clipped to Bobby's finger, a blood pressure cuff going on his arm. Jesse stood in the entrance to the front room and watched a man who had clearly done this before take control of a medical situation in her living room with a quietness that left no room for drama. His name was Danny, one of the others said when he noticed her watching. He was a paramedic before he started riding full-time. Bobby opened his eyes and looked up at Jesse from the couch with an expression of profound embarrassment. "Ma'am, I apologize sincerely for this." "Don't talk," Danny said without looking up from the blood pressure cuff. "I'm just saying," Bobby said. "I know what you're saying. Stop saying it and breathe." Bobby closed his eyes. Jesse almost smiled. Caleb appeared beside her, not too close, just within speaking distance. He was looking at the front room with the attention of a man cataloging things he was responsible for not disturbing. His gaze moved across the bookshelves, the old rocking chair, the photographs on the mantel, and then stopped. He was looking at the photograph of her father. It was the largest one on the mantel, a frame her mother had bought at an estate sale, dark wood, slightly too formal for the casual image inside it. Ray Calloway at 43, standing beside the truck. He had been restoring a wrench in one hand and his iron veil vest open over a flannel shirt, squinting against the sun in the specific way of men who spent time outdoors and never remembered to bring sunglasses. Caleb looked at that photograph for a moment longer than the other things. He said quietly so Bobby could not hear from the couch, "I should have come sooner. I kept telling myself there was a right time." He stopped and seemed to reassess the sentence. "There is no right time for some things. There is only late and later." Jesse did not say anything. She was not ready to give him the ease of absolution, but she did not move away either. She went to the kitchen and filled the kettle because the kitchen was the room where she knew what to do with her hands. She could hear the low voices in the front room, Danny talking to Bobby, and the patient, repetitive cadences of someone monitoring and reassessing, one of the other men asking Caleb something in a murmur, Caleb responding with two words that settled whatever the question was. She found herself standing at the counter with the kettle in her hand and the grocery list still on the table in front of her. She had not burned it. She had not been able to bring herself to put it in the fire after what she had read, even though she did not yet understand what it meant. She had set it under the edge of the sugar bowl with the ceramic rooster, and it had been there when she went to the window and when she opened the door. Caleb Maddox appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had left the front room quietly, the way large men sometimes learn to move when they had spent years navigating spaces that were not built for them. He stopped at the edge of the kitchen and looked at the table, not with the blunt curiosity of someone prying, with the recognition of someone who had seen similar tables and knew what the papers and envelopes and careful placement of the sugar bowl on top of certain things usually meant. He said, "How long have you been holding this by yourself?" "Since my mother's second round," Jesse said. "August." He nodded as if she had confirmed something he already suspected. She turned and looked at him directly for the first time since she had opened the door. He was older than she had expected. The photograph in the Mia's folder, the laughing man beside her father, that man had been younger. This one carried the years in the way certain men did not, as damage exactly, but as weight distributed evenly, like he had learned to balance it over decades of practice. The iron veil patch was still there, top rocker and bottom rocker, and the center image worn to the softness of cloth that had been through years of weather. His hands were the hands of a man who worked with them regularly, scarred across the knuckles, a callus at the base of his right thumb, where a specific grip repeated itself over years. He said, "Your father told me about you." He said it the way people said things that were true but insufficient, aware that the words were smaller than what they carried. Jesse said, "He told me about you, too, in his way." Caleb's eyes came back to her face. How? She pointed at the grocery list under the sugar bowl. She watched him recognize his own nickname, written in Ray Calloway's handwriting. He went still, not surprised exactly, something more careful than surprise. He said, "How much of that paper did you read?" "All of it," Jesse said. "I don't know what most of it means, but I didn't burn it." Caleb looked at the paper and then at the fire she had lit in the front room, visible through the doorway where the glow moved across the floor. He understood the sequence she was describing without her having to explain it. Close, very close. He said, "We need to talk. Not tonight while Bobby is in there, not with half the chapter on your porch, but before morning, we need to talk. There are things about your father's death and about Frank Greer and about that property that you deserve to know, and I have been trying to find the right way to tell you for 2 years." The kitchen was quiet except for the kettle starting to build toward its whistle. Snow pressed against the window in the particular way it pressed when the wind was coming from the northwest and the storm had settled in for the night. Jessie looked at this man who had stood at a graveside she had not invited him to and sent money she had not thanked him for, and apparently spent 2 years trying to figure out how to have a conversation she was only now ready to have. She took down 2 mugs from the cabinet above the sink. Her mother's good mugs, the ones with the blue rim. She said, "Bobby needs at least an hour." Caleb said, "Yes." She said, "Then we have time. Sit down." He sat down at the white oak table her father had built, and outside the storm committed itself fully to the night, and inside the kettle began to whistle, and Jesse Calloway poured water over 2 tea bags, and for the first time in 4 years, felt the particular quality of attention that came when someone who knew the person you lost walked into the room and made them real again. Caleb held his mug with both hands and did not speak immediately. He looked at the table with the specific regard of a man deciding where to start something that could start in many places, most of them wrong. He said Ray was worried about that contract from the day he signed it. He never told your mother the full story because she was already sick by then, and he did not want to add to what she was carrying. He told me. He called me from a gas station on Route 9 6 days before he died and talked for 40 minutes. I was in New Hampshire at the time. I listened to everything he said, and I told him to get the documents together and come see the legal guy our chapter uses for property disputes, and we would sort it out together. He said he would. He said he was going to stop at the county clerk's office on the way through Montpelier and file something first so there would be a record that was harder to disappear. Jessie's hands were flat on the table. She said he never made it to Montpelier. "He made it," Caleb said. "He filed. We found that out later, 18 months later, when our chapter vice president went and looked at the public records. Your father got to the county clerk at 2:15 on a Wednesday afternoon and filed a document and then drove south on Route 9 and went off the road at mile marker 34 about 3 hours later." The kitchen clock above the sink ticked through several seconds. Jessie said, "What was in the document?" Caleb said, "The original survey, the one that had been on file since your grandfather bought the property. 51 acres, not the 14 that Greer's paperwork shows. The land behind this house, the pasture and the creek and the woodlot that goes up to the ridge, all of that is supposed to be part of this parcel. It was always part of this parcel. Greer found a way to separate it on paper, or rather he found someone who would sign off on a revised survey, and then he found a way to buy that back parcel for $18,000 through a shell company 2 months after your father died." Jessie said, "The development." Caleb looked at her. She said there was something in the county planning report last spring. I read it and then I set it down because I had other things to worry about. New residential development on the ridge north of Iron Mills. 43 units. I thought it was unrelated land. Caleb said, "It is not unrelated land. The fire popped in the front room. Danny's voice came low and steady. Bobby, stay with me. Tell me what you had for breakfast. Bobby's voice came back. I had gas station coffee and a granola bar, and I knew that was a mistake at the time. Good. That means your memory's working. Keep talking. Caleb and Jesse sat at the table in the kitchen light, and the storm went on outside, and neither of them spoke for a moment because some information needs a moment before the next sentence can follow it. Then Jesse said, he knew. He knew what Greer was doing, and he was trying to stop it. Caleb said, yes. She said, in the paper I almost burned tonight. He said, as part of a chain your father built so that someone ideally you would be able to pick it back up. He thought he was going to be the one to use it. He was wrong about the timeline. Jessie pressed both hands flat against her father's table. The wood was smooth under her palms from years of use, worn to the particular softness of surfaces that had been touched often by people who loved them. She felt the grain of it, the way she had felt the grain of other solid things in her life, when the solid things were all she had. She said, how much time do we have? Caleb said, Greer is coming tomorrow at 9 to get your signature on the sale agreement. She said, it is already tomorrow. He looked at the clock. Past midnight. She was right. She said, then we have 9 hours. He said, less because we need 2 of them for Bobby, and then I need to make some calls and the road is going to be buried by morning. From the front room, Bobby called out, is anyone going to tell me what is happening? Or am I just going to lie here and listen to the wind? Danny said, you are going to lie there and listen to the wind for at least another 20 minutes. Bobby said, I am fine. Danny said, I know you are fine. The 20 minutes is not about fine, it is about protocol. Bobby said, I am 61 years old and I have been useful my whole life. I am entitled to a brief, useful phase right now. Jesse went to the doorway and looked at Bobby on the couch with the pulse oximeter still on his finger and the color coming back into his face and the general expression of a man who found his own situation slightly ridiculous. She said, Bobby, what do you know about this? Bobby looked at her with the clear eyes of a man who had been waiting for that exact question. He said, I was there when Ray signed the contract. I drove him to Greer's office because his truck was in for service. I sat in the parking lot and I waited. He came out after 40 minutes and he was pale. Not sick, the other kind of pale. He said Greer had added a boundary clause he had not seen in the version he reviewed 2 days earlier. He said he signed because your mother's procedure was scheduled for the next morning and the insurance hold had not cleared and they needed the money that afternoon. He stopped. He looked at the ceiling. He said, I should have gone in with him. I should not have let him walk into that office alone. I have thought about that every day since. Jesse said, it is not your fault. Bobby said, I know whose fault it is. I am just telling you I was there. I can say I was there, in writing or in court or wherever someone needs me to say it. The room was quiet except for the storm and the small sound of the pulse oximeter and the fire settling into its coals. Jesse said, thank you, Bobby. He said, your father was a good man. He deserved better than what happened to him. So does this house. She went back to the kitchen and sat down across from Caleb and looked at the items on the table. The grocery list under the sugar bowl, the empty mug she had set aside when she went to check on Bobby. Outside the window, the snow had built another inch against the lower frame. She said there is something else. She told him about the woman at the bank. Lena, the name tag had said. The way she had paused over the county records and looked at the acreage listed and then looked at Jesse with an expression that lasted only a second before going neutral again. Jesse said, I did not know what it meant then. I had too many other things to think about. But she saw something. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He said, do you remember which branch? She said Main Street, the county branch. He nodded and wrote something in a small notebook he had pulled from his vest pocket. He said, if she has been processing Greer-related transactions through that branch, she has seen the paper trail at close range. Whether she would say so out loud is a different question. But it is worth knowing she exists. Jesse said, you think she knows something? He said, I think anyone who looked at those records closely enough and cared enough to pause would know that something did not add up. She looked at the acreage, you said. Jesse said, she looked twice. Caleb wrote something else in the notebook. He said, that matters. She looked at the window where the snow had built against the lower frame. She said there is a woman out there who may have seen what happened on paper and stayed quiet because she was scared or because she did not have anything concrete enough to say. And tonight there is a man at my kitchen table who has been carrying evidence for 4 years waiting for someone to give it to. Caleb said, your father trusted people to hold things until they were needed. That is how he built the chain. She said, and now we find out if the chain holds. He said, we also need to find the lockbox. She looked at him. He reached into the inside pocket of his vest and produced a small brass key on a plain ring. He set it on the table between them without comment. Jessie picked it up. It was warm from being carried close to a body for a long time. She held it for a moment, feeling its weight, which was slight, but it definite, the weight of a deliberate thing. She said, how long have you had this? He said, 4 years. Your father gave it to me the last time I saw him, 3 weeks before he died. He said, if anything happens, find Jessie, give her the key, and tell her the box is the start of it. Not the whole thing, the start. She said, what is the whole thing? He said, we are going to find out tonight. She stood up. She picked up the flashlight from the counter. She said, come with me. She walked down the back hall toward the office that still smelled like her father's cedar and motor oil, in the faint ghost of the coffee he had drunk every morning in the same blue thermos for 20 years. She did not look back to see if Caleb was following, because she already knew he was. Some things did not need checking. Some things you knew by the sound of them, steady and present and there. She knelt at the bottom shelf of the filing cabinet and found the box exactly where she had seen it in her 3 nights of searching, a small metal lockbox, gray. Unremarkable, the kind sold at hardware stores for $20. She put the key in the lock. It turned on the first try. Inside the box were 4 things. A folded document with a county clerk's stamp dated March 14th, 2019. A handwritten letter in Ray Calloway's careful block printing on 3 pages of yellow legal pad paper. A small USB drive in a plastic case. And beneath all of it, a photograph she had not seen before her father, at a much younger age, standing with her mother on the porch of this house. Both of them laughing, Diana's head tilted back, Ray's arm around her shoulders, the mountain behind them in full summer green. On the back of that photograph, Ray had written 2 sentences. For Jessie, the house is yours. Fight for it. She stayed kneeling on the floor of her father's office for a long moment with the photograph in both hands. Caleb Maddox stood in the doorway behind her and did not say anything, which was the right thing, because there were moments that did not need words added to them. Moments that were already complete in themselves, heavy with everything that had led to them. Then Jessie Calloway stood up. She had her father's jaw and her mother's eyes and 4 years of compressed grief in her chest that had just found the shape of a direction to move in. She turned around and held out the folded county document. She said, tell me what this says. And outside the blizzard roared, and the night pressed in on every side, and the house that Ray Calloway had filled with solid, handmade things held its ground, the way it always had, the way things held when they were built to last. The county document was 1-page stamped and dated, bearing the official seal of Washington County, Vermont, and the signature of a deputy clerk whose name was printed in small type beneath an illegible pen stroke. Caleb spread it flat on the kitchen table and weighted the corners with the sugar bowl, the flashlight, a spare mug, in his own hand. He read it the way men read things when they wanted to be sure, slowly, with his lips barely moving, going back once to reread a section in the middle before he looked up. He said, this is the certified copy of the original 1987 survey. Your grandfather's survey. It lists the parcel as 51.3 acres with boundaries marked by the creek bed to the east, the ridgeline to the north, Ridgeline Road to the south, and the Baxter Timber Lot to the west. He tapped a number in the corner. This lot number. That is the number that should appear on your deed and on the county tax records. Jessie sat across from him with the yellow legal pad letter in her lap, reading through it in the kitchen light. Her father's handwriting was large and deliberate, the handwriting of someone who had taught himself to be careful about letters because he had not always been. She read without interrupting herself, which meant she was reading it the way it deserved to be read. She finished the 3rd page and set it face down on the table. She did not speak immediately. She pressed one hand flat on the yellow paper and looked at the kitchen window where frost had built, in the lower corners, small crystals organizing themselves into patterns that had no concern for anything happening on the other side of the glass. She said he knew about the development. He knew what the back acreage was worth once the Ridge Road was approved. Caleb said that the Ridge Road was in county planning as early as 2018. Greer was on the county's zoning advisory board from 2016 to 2020. He knew what was coming before most people in iron mills were paying attention to those meetings. She said, and my father signed the contract in March 2019, because my mother had her first biopsy in February 2019, And they needed money for the initial tests and the specialist consult, and they thought the insurance would cover more than it did. Caleb said nothing. He had heard this shape before. The shape of people who were not poor but were not rich trying to manage a health crisis without the kind of cushion that made management possible, making decisions under pressure that looked different in retrospect when the pressure was no longer the thing they were thinking about. She said Greer came to them. He came to them specifically. He knew about the diagnosis because his wife was on the hospital foundation board, and they got the donor list, which included my mother, because she gave $20 every year for 18 years. He came to them with a proposal that would solve the immediate problem. Caleb said, "That is my understanding of how it happened. Your father did not realize the significance of the back acreage until later, until the Ridge Road approval started moving through the planning board, and he started attending those meetings and reading the documents and understanding what the land was actually going to be worth." She said, "How much?" Caleb picked up a folded piece of paper from his vest pocket. He had been carrying it for 2 years. He unfolded it and set it on the table beside the county document. It was a printout from a county planning website dated 14 months ago. The proposed development that showed 43 residential units on a parcel of land identified by lot number. The lot number matched the one on the 1987 survey. Jessie looked at the estimated development value in the planning summary. She looked at it for a long time. She said $1.4 million. Caleb said, "That is the construction value estimate. The land value before development, based on comparable sales in the county over the past 3 years, is closer to $400,000. She sat with that number in the kitchen of a house that a $67,000 hospital bill was about to take from her. She said he sold it for $18,000 through a shell company. Caleb said, "We believe so. The chapter's vice president has been doing property records research. There is a limited liability company called Blue Ridge Holdings, registered in Delaware, that purchased a 14.2-acre parcel adjacent to the Callaway property in June 2021 for $17,500. Delaware registration means the company does not have to disclose its principals publicly. But the registered agent is a law firm in Burlington that has handled other transactions for Greer." Jessie said, "That is the back pasture. The creek and the woodlot up to the ridge. That is where my father used to run a winter trail for the horses before the horses were sold." She picked up the USB drive in its plastic case. She held it up. She said, "Do I want to know what is on this?" Caleb said, "Your father spent the last 6 months of his life documenting everything he could find. Dates, names, meeting minutes, property transfers. He was methodical about it. He made a copy and he gave the drive to me at a rest stop on I-89 in February, and he said, 'This is evidence.' He said it with the kind of calm that told me he was scared, but had decided not to let the scared part make his decisions." She said, "And you have been holding it for 4 years. He said, "I have been holding it and waiting for the right person to give it to and the right moment to give it. I did not think the right moment was going to come looking for me through a blizzard at 9:15 on a Tuesday night, but that is generally how right moments work." From the front room, Bobby called out, "Is anyone going to tell me what is happening, or am I just going to lie here and listen to the wind?" Danny said, "You are going to lie there and listen to the wind for at least another 20 minutes. Bobby said, "I am fine." Danny said, "I know you are fine. The 20 minutes is not about fine. It is about protocol." Bobby said, "I am 61 years old and I have been useful my whole life. I am entitled to a brief useful phase right now." Jesse stood and went to the doorway and looked at Bobby on the couch. His color was fully back now, and he had the specific expression of a man who was genuinely improved but slightly offended by being treated as anything less. She said, "Bobby, what do you know about this?" Bobby looked at her with the clear eyes of a man who had been waiting for that exact question. He said, "I was there when Ray signed the contract. I drove him to Greer's office because his truck was in for service. He came out after 40 minutes and he was pale. Not sick, the other kind of pale. He said Greer had added a boundary clause he had not seen in the version he reviewed 2 days earlier. He said he signed because your mother's procedure was scheduled for the next morning and they needed the money that afternoon." He stopped. He said, "I should have gone in with him. I have thought about that every day since." Jesse said, "It is not your fault." Bobby said, "I know whose fault it is. I am just telling you I was there. I can say I was there, in writing or in court or wherever someone needs me to say it." Jesse said, "Thank you, Bobby." He said, "Your father was a good man. He deserved better than what happened to him. So does this house." She went back to the kitchen and sat down across from Caleb. She said, "What do we need to stop Greer in the morning?" Caleb said, "Oh, we need three things. We need to reach Wade, our chapter's vice president, who has been working on the property research. We need to reach the legal aid attorney our chapter uses for property matters. And we need to reach someone at the county clerk's office who can confirm that the March 2019 document is still on file and has not been altered or removed." She said, "Can you do all of that from here?" He said, "My phone has one bar, sometimes two. It goes in and out with the storm. But yes, I can do it." She said, "Do it." He pulled out his phone and went to the back doorway where the signal was marginally better, and she heard him dial and wait and dial again. His voice low and steady, not urgent, because urgency was for people who had not already decided what they were going to do. He sounded like a man who had already decided. Wade Collins was 58 years old and had been called preacher since his 20s when he had repaired motorcycles behind a church in Ohio and could quote scripture, baseball statistics, and engine manuals with equal fluency. He had spent 18 months doing property records research in Washington County with the focused patience of a man who understood that careful work done slowly was more durable than fast work done impressively. He had been awake. He had been waiting for exactly this call. When Caleb relayed what Wade had confirmed about the survey discrepancy, Jesse listened to all of it without speaking. The revised survey filed with Greer's contract in 2019 showed the Callaway property as 14.2 acres, with the boundary line redrawn to the existing fence line along the back pasture rather than the creek bed. The fence had been put in by a previous owner and had never had legal standing as a property line, but in the revised survey it was marked as the eastern boundary with notations suggesting it had always been there. The original 1987 survey showed 51.3 acres with the creek as the eastern boundary. If both documents were still on file, the case was not complicated. It was the kind of case that a good attorney could lay in front of a judge in 2 hours. Caleb put the phone on the table and said, "Wade is calling the attorney tonight. Tom Harkness. He has done this kind of case before. They will both be here by morning if the plows run on schedule." Jesse said, "And the county clerk." He said, "That is tomorrow morning at 8 when they open, but the document is on public record. Your father filed in person. He kept the certified copy. He built a chain your father was thorough about building, and thorough chains are harder to break than people usually expect." She said, "You think the document is still there?" He said, "I think your father was careful. He built it like a table, solid, intended to last." The hours moved the way hours moved in storms, not in clean increments, but in gathered pools of activity and waiting. Danny went to the front room and slept in the armchair, waking every hour to check Bobby, who by 3 in the morning was sitting up and drinking tea and talking to anyone who would listen about a property dispute he had been involved in Oklahoma in 1989, which he maintained had certain relevant parallels. Jesse made crackers with peanut butter because it was past midnight and no one had eaten. She set a plate in the middle of the table without ceremony, and the men ate without ceremony in return, which she appreciated. She had expected men like these to take up more room than they did. Instead, they folded themselves around the available space and moved carefully and asked before touching anything that was not theirs. One of the younger riders, a man they called Patch, said to her at some point around 2 in the morning, "Your house has good bones." She had said, "My father built it that way." He had nodded as if that explained something he had already suspected. At 5:30, while the storm was beginning its slow withdrawal, Caleb told her about her father in the desert. He said it without prompting, while they were sitting at the table with the last of the tea and the fire in the front room reduced to coals and the house breathing slowly around them. He said Ray used to talk about this place on long runs, the creek and the woodlot and the pasture. He said it like a man reading a map back to himself to make sure he remembered the way home. Jesse said, "He loved it here." Caleb said, "He loved you here. He talked about you more than the property. He said you had your grandmother's eyes and your mother's stubbornness and something of your own that he could not name, but that he recognized every time you made a decision you had already committed to. He said it was the best thing about you." She said, "What decision was he thinking of when he said that?" Caleb said, "I asked him that once. He said the time you were 7 and there was a dog in the road and you got out of the car without asking and went and sat beside it in the rain until your father could get a vet on the phone, and he came out of the car and found you there with the dog's head in your lap and your best coat soaked through. He said you did not look up when he arrived. You said, 'I found him.' So now we help him. Jessie was quiet for a moment. She did not remember that exactly. She remembered the dog. She did not remember it being particular or specific in the way her father had apparently stored it. She said he remembered that. Caleb said, he remembered most things about you. He kept a photograph in his saddlebag. He showed it to me once about 8 years ago. You were maybe 14, 15, standing on the back porch of this house with your arms crossed and an expression he said was her waiting for me to explain myself. He said it every time. She looked at the table. She thought about a man she had spent 4 years being angry at, who had spent 8 years carrying a photograph of a teenager standing on a porch with her arms crossed, who had written a letter in longhand so he would not edit out the parts that needed to be there. She said he never said any of this to me. Caleb said he was better at preparing than at saying. He was working on the saying. He ran out of time. The statement was simple, and Jessie received it that way not as an accusation or an apology, but as a fact about a man who had built things carefully and left some of them unfinished because time had not cooperated with his intentions. She said, tell me one more thing about him. Caleb looked at the table. He said, he made terrible coffee. He had been making it the same way for 30 years, and every time without fail he would taste it and say, that is worse than yesterday's, and then he would drink the entire pot because waste offended him. It was the one thing nobody could get him to change. She laughed. It came out short and surprised and real. Caleb looked at her with an expression she would come to know as his version of warmth, which was not demonstrative but was complete. He said, there it is. She said, what? He said, that laugh. He said you had a laugh that arrived before you could decide about it. He said that was the best kind of honest. Wade arrived at 6:47 in the morning, 40 minutes after the first plow came through, on the county road driving a truck with chains on the rear wheels, and Tom Harkness in the passenger seat with a leather briefcase on his lap, and snow already building on the hood. Tom was a compact man in his 50s, with the alert eyes of someone who had learned to read documents the way other people read faces quickly, and for what was not said as much as what was. He shook Jessie's hand, said he was sorry about her father, and then sat at the kitchen table and opened his briefcase and got to work. He went through the county document, the yellow legal pad letter, the USB drive contents on Jessie's laptop, and the planning printout in an hour and 20 minutes. He asked questions that were specific and answered questions that were less specific with patience but brevity. When he was finished, he set his pen down and said, this is a strong case. Not a perfect case because perfect cases are rare, and this one will depend on the county record being intact. But this is strong. He said, I need to be at the county clerk's office when it opens at 8. I need to pull the original filing record and confirm the document is present and in its original form. If it is, I file an emergency motion to halt the sale, and I request a hearing on the property boundary dispute. Greer will be served before noon. Jessie said, he is coming here at 9. Tom said, good. Let him come. Do not sign anything. Do not let anyone in this house, except under the presence of another adult who is not affiliated with Greer. Document every interaction from the moment his vehicle arrives. He wrote his cell number on the top sheet of his notepad and tore it off and set it in front of her. He looked around the kitchen at the table at the old photographs on the hallway wall visible through the doorway at the cracker plate that had been washed and set in the drying rack. He said your father was thorough. He did not leave this to chance. Jessie said he was careful about things that mattered. Tom Harkness picked up his briefcase and left, and Jessie stood at the window and watched his truck back down the drive and turn north toward Montpelier. The hour between 7 and 8 was strange. The storm had moved east, leaving behind a white silence that was almost too complete after a night of noise. Light came into the kitchen differently in snow mornings, softer and more distributed, as if the sky had decided to be gentle. Jessie stood at the window with coffee and watched the yard emerge from the dark. Her mother's yard, her father's fence line, the back pasture where the horses had been, and beyond it the creek she could not see from here, but knew was there running under the ice in the particular way that cold Vermont creeks ran in January, not stopped exactly, just patient. And beyond the creek, the woodlot that climbed to the ridge, 51.3 acres, of the kind of land that people in this state had understood the value of long before development plans and planning boards and men in suits from Burlington had found their way to it. Her father had ridden this road 500 times. He had driven this drive in every season for 30 years. He had built a table and sanded it smooth on 3 weekends, while a 9-year-old handed him sandpaper. He had understood what this place was, and he had been careful, and he had been thorough, and he had been afraid, but had decided not to let the afraid part make his decisions. Her phone rang at 8:12. Tom Harkness. She answered it before the second ring. He said, "The document is on file. Original 1987 survey certified copy stamped and dated March 14th, 2019, received and logged by Deputy Clerk Margaret Sorrells, who retired in 2022, but whose records confirm the receipt. The document is intact. It has not been altered. The lot number matches your grandfather's deed and the acreage listed is 51.3. She pressed her hand flat against the window frame, cold glass under her palm. He said, "I am filing the emergency motion in the next 30 minutes. Greer's attorney will be notified before 9. When Greer shows up at your property this morning, he will already know." She said, "Thank you." He said, "Your father made this possible. I am just carrying what he built." She hung up. She turned around. Caleb was in the kitchen doorway. Wade was behind him. Bobby was on his feet in the hallway, looking healthier than a man had a right to look 12 hours after a cardiac episode. Danny was at the table. And through the window behind them all, she could see 3 more men from Iron Vale who had come in from the porch and stood quietly in the entry, snow still on their shoulders, waiting without pushing. She said, "The document is on file. Tom is filing the motion. It is done." The kitchen went quiet in the specific way kitchens went quiet when news arrived that was too large for noise. Then Wade said quietly, "Ray, you thorough old man." Bobby made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh. Danny looked at the table. The men in the entry went still with the particular stillness of people absorbing something important. Caleb looked at Jesse. He did not say anything. He looked at her the way people looked at each other when something had been completed that was a long time coming, a look that carried all the years before it and knew exactly what they had cost. She looked back at him the same way. Frank Greer arrived at 9:04 in the morning. He drove a black SUV that had been washed recently enough to still show the effort, the kind of vehicle that communicated a specific type of careful ambition. He came up the drive slowly, which Jesse noted because men who arrived slowly at places they intended to own were either confident or already recalculating. She was standing on the porch when he pulled up. She had not planned to stand on the porch, but she had ended up there naturally, the way people ended up in the positions that matched what they had decided. Behind her, the front door was open. The kitchen light was on. Greer stepped out of the SUV and looked at the motorcycles and trucks pulled in along the fence and the drive, and his face did the thing that faces did when they expected one thing and encountered another. He composed it quickly, which told her he was experienced at composing it. He was 55, broad-shouldered, with the careful grooming and the good coat of a man who had decided that appearance was a form of argument. He carried himself with the ease of someone accustomed to arriving and being the most prepared person in the room. He looked at Jesse on the porch. He said, "Good morning, Miss Calloway." She said, "Good morning, Mr. Greer." He said, "You have company." She said, "I do." His phone buzzed in his coat pocket. She watched him decide not to look at it. Then it buzzed again, and the second time he looked. She watched his face while he read whatever Tom Harkness had sent to his attorney. It was a brief reading, maybe 4 seconds. What changed in his expression was not large, but it was definite, the way a door looked the same when it was locked as when it was not until you tried it. He put the phone back in his coat pocket. He looked at her. He said, "You filed a motion." She said, "My attorney filed a motion." He said, "You do not have an attorney." She said, "I have one now." He stood at the bottom of the porch steps. He had not moved to come up them, which she thought was interesting. She thought about what Caleb had said the night before, that Greer would fight because $400,000 was worth fighting, but fighting uphill. He said, "This is a misunderstanding, Miss Calloway. The property boundary in the contract reflects the current legal survey on file with the county planning office." She said, "Not the oldest one." He said, "The most recent one is legally controlling." She said, "The most recent one was filed by your company 18 months after my father died. The one my father filed on the last day he drove to Montpelier is 32 years older and shows 51.3 acres with the creek as the eastern boundary." His attorney stepped out of the SUV at that point, a younger man carrying his briefcase like a prop he had not yet learned to use comfortably. He started up the drive, and Caleb stepped out of the front doorway onto the porch beside Jesse. He did not say anything. He did not need to. He was simply there, which was its own form of language. Greer looked at Caleb. He took the full measure of the man, the vest, the size, the complete lack of either aggression or accommodation in his posture. Then he looked back at Jesse. He said quietly and with the first genuine edge of something beneath the pleasant surface, "You do not know what you are getting into." Jesse said, "I know exactly what I am getting into." He said, "This will take years in court and cost more than the property is worth in legal fees." She said, "That would be my decision to make." He said, "Your mother's treatment," she said, "is being handled." Something moved across his face, a reassessment, a calculating shift she recognized as the moment when a man moved from expecting to negotiate to understanding that negotiation was not what was happening here. His attorney reached them and said something to Greer in a low voice. Greer listened. Then he turned to Jesse with a different expression. Not pleasantness this time, something flatter. He said, "The motion does not change the sale agreement." She said, "The motion halts the sale agreement pending a hearing on the boundary dispute. I was told you would be served before 9. Have you been served?" A county sheriff's vehicle had come up the road behind Greer's SUV while they were talking. It stopped at the foot of the drive. A deputy got out carrying a yellow document. Greer turned and looked at the deputy and then turned back to Jesse. He had the expression of a man watching a sequence of events that he had not written arrange themselves into a shape he did not want. She said, "You can leave the way you came, Mr. Greer." He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze without effort because there was nothing in it she had not been prepared for. Her father had been careful. She had found what he left. The chain had held. Greer turned, walked to his SUV, and drove back down the drive. His attorney followed in a second vehicle. The deputy served the motion to the second vehicle's windshield wiper and walked back to his cruiser with the unhurried efficiency of someone completing a task on a list. Jessie stood on the porch until both vehicles were gone. Then she let out a breath she had been holding since approximately 9 the previous evening. Caleb said beside her, "Good morning." She said, "Good morning." Wade appeared behind them with 2 mugs of coffee and the specific satisfaction of a man whose research had turned out to matter. He handed Jesse a mug and said, "For the record, I have been waiting a long time to see that man drive away from something he wanted." Bobby appeared in the doorway wrapped in a borrowed jacket that was too short in the sleeves. He said, "I missed it. What happened?" Danny said from inside Greer left. Bobby said, "That's it." Danny said, "That is it." Bobby said, "I stayed on that couch through a cardiac episode for this. Someone could have knocked on the window." Despite herself, despite 4 years of compressed grief and a night of no sleep, in a blizzard, in a morning that had just rearranged the shape of her life, Jessie laughed. It came out surprised the way genuine laughter came when it arrived before you could decide about it. Bobby looked at her with great dignity. He said, "I will accept that as gratitude." She said, "It is, Bobby, thank you." He waved it off, but she saw him smile at the porch boards. Tom Harkness arrived at 10:30 behind the second plow and spent 2 hours at the kitchen table with a Jesse going through the next steps. He explained the injunction. He explained the boundary dispute filing. He explained the timeline for a hearing and the likely shape of Greer's response. Between his explanations, something else arrived. At 11:30, a blue car came up the drive and stopped behind Wade's truck. The woman who got out had dark hair and a long coat, and she stood at the gate for a moment before Jesse, watching from the window, recognized the careful posture. Lena, the woman from the bank. She was carrying a manila envelope, and she held it with both hands against her chest in the way people held things they had decided not to put down until they were sure about what they were handing them to. She looked at the motorcycles and the trucks and the men moving around the yard, and then she looked at the front porch where Jesse had appeared. Jesse came down the steps. She said, "I remember you." The woman said, "Lena Marsh. I work at the county branch. I have been working there for 6 years." She paused. She looked at the envelope in her hands. She said, "I saw what happened to this property in the records 2 years ago. I did not say anything because I did not have anything concrete enough. And because Frank Greer is on the County Economic Development Board, and I have a lease and a student loan, and I thought, what would I even say and to whom?" She stopped. She said, "I heard on the radio this morning that there was a legal challenge filed on this property. And I thought if someone else found it, then what I have is not just a feeling anymore. It is corroboration." She held out the envelope. Jesse took it. She opened it and looked at the first page. It was a photocopy of a transaction record dated June 2021, showing a wire transfer from an account affiliated with Blue Ridge Holdings to a separate account. Beside the transfer, in neat handwriting in the margin, Lena had written, "This account was opened by the registered agent firm of Greer's Burlington attorneys 4 months before the survey revision was filed." There were 7 more pages. Jesse looked at Lena Marsh and said, "You kept copies." Lena said I made them the week after I first saw it. I put them in a folder, and I put the folder in my car, and I told myself I was going to do something with them, and then I did not for 2 years. She paused. I am sorry it took me this long. Jesse said you came. That is what matters. She brought Lena inside and introduced her to Tom, who went through the envelope with the focused speed of a man who had just been handed 7 additional pages of what he needed. He looked up after 12 minutes and said, "This establishes the financial connection between the survey revision and Greer's purchasing entity 6 weeks before the revision was filed. That is not ambiguous." Lena sat at the table with her hands around a mug of tea in the careful posture of someone who had made a decision and was still in the process of understanding what it cost and what it freed. She said, "He came into the branch twice while I was processing the title transfer. He was friendly. He knew everyone's name. He asked about my loan." She said it without bitterness, just as information, the description of a method she had now had enough time to name. Jesse said, "You were not the only one who did not see it fast enough." Lena looked at her. She said, "Your father saw it." Jesse said, "Yes, he did." The legal process after that moved with the particular momentum of a case that had been well built and was now being well presented. Tom filed the emergency motion. Wade provided the property records documentation. Bobby gave a written affidavit. Lena provided her bank records with a formal statement prepared with Tom's guidance. The USB drive contents were authenticated and submitted as supporting evidence. Greer's attorney filed 2 responses in the first week. Both were denied. The boundary dispute was scheduled for a formal hearing. The AG's office opened an inquiry into Blue Ridge Holdings. The surveying firm that had filed the 2019 revision lost its county registration pending review. Jessie went back to work at the diner during the weeks the legal process moved. She did not tell her coworkers more than they asked. She called her mother every evening. Diana's voice got stronger each week, the voice of a woman whose body had decided to continue its argument with the disease and was winning the current round. There was a morning in early February when the case had been filed for 3 weeks and the hearing was 2 weeks away, and Jessie drove home from the diner at midnight through roads that were clear and cold and deeply familiar. She turned up the drive and sat in the truck for a moment before going in, looking at the house with the porch light on and the maple trees in the yard with their winter branches and the fence line her father had built along the road. She thought about the 11 days the envelope had sat on that table. She thought about the fire in the grate and the grocery list she had almost dropped into it. She thought about the sound of 3 deliberate knocks on a door she had not wanted to open. She went inside. She made tea. She sat at her father's table and read his letter again, not because she needed to, but because some things wanted to be read more than once. The letter began, "Jessie, if you are reading this, the right way has not been easy. It never is with things worth keeping. I want you to know several things that I should have said out loud more often. The first thing, this house is yours, not mine, not the bank's, not some developers. Yours. The second thing, the men in my chapter are the most honest people I know. They kept their word to me in every situation that tested it. They will keep their word to you if you let them. The third thing, Caleb Maddox is the best man I know outside of blood. He has the information you need. He has been holding it because he did not want to come to you without something worth bringing. When he comes, let him talk. He is not good at pretty words, but he is very good at the things that count. The fourth thing, I am sorry I did not fight harder sooner. I found out too late what Greer was doing, and then your mother got sick, and I spent 6 months trying to manage too many things at once instead of going directly at the one that needed to be gone at directly. I built the chain because it was the best I could do with the time I had. I hope it is enough. The fifth thing, I love you. I have always loved you. Even when you were looking out the window when the chapter came by on that Sunday in July and you thought I did not know you were watching. I knew. You look at things the way your grandmother looked at things. Straight on, and then you decide. She had read the fifth thing many times. She had thought about it most. He had known she was at the window. He had not said anything, not written about it with any judgment, just noted it as a thing he had observed, a thing that told him something true about her. He had been giving her time to decide. She folded the letter and put it back in the lockbox, which now lived on the shelf above the kitchen window, where she could see it from the table. She went to bed. She slept well. In the third week of February, Jessie drove to Burlington on a Saturday morning without telling anyone. She parked on a side street and walked 3 blocks to a building she had found through Tom, a community legal aid office that shared a floor with a veterans organization and a housing advocacy nonprofit. She went to the third floor and knocked on an open door. A woman in her 40s looked up from a desk covered in files. She said, "Can I help you?" Jesse said, "I want to know if you need volunteers. I am not a lawyer, I am a waitress. But I have been through a property fraud case recently, and I understand some things about how they work, and I thought maybe that was useful to someone." The woman put down her pen. She said, "How recently?" Jesse said, 6 weeks ago. The woman said, "Sit down." She sat down. The woman said, "We have 3 active property cases in this county right now, and 2 more flagged in the system. In all 5 cases, the owners are people who cannot easily access the process without help." She paused. "What we need is not legal expertise. We have lawyers. What we need is people who can sit across a kitchen table from someone who is scared and confused and explain to them what a county recorder's office is and why the document they almost threw away matters." Jesse said, "I can do that." The woman said, "I know you can. Tom Harkness called us last month and said you might come by." Jesse said, "He did." The woman said, "He said your father built something that worked because he understood the system well enough to use it. He said you might have inherited that." Jesse looked at the woman. She thought about an oak table sanded on 3 weekends. She thought about a brass key in a vest pocket for 4 years. She thought about a grocery list turned face down in a misc folder. She said he was a careful man. The woman said Tom said the same thing. He said careful was the operative word. The hearing was on a Thursday morning in February when the snow was still deep on the ground, but the sky had gone from iron to something closer to blue. Tom Harkness appeared for Jesse. Greer's attorney, a Burlington firm with 3 partners and an impressive letterhead, appeared for Frank Greer. The hearing lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. The judge was a woman in her 60s with the specific patience of someone who had presided over enough property cases to recognize the shape of them quickly. She reviewed the 1987 survey and the 2019 revised survey. She reviewed the certified copy Ray Calloway had filed in March of that year. She reviewed Tom's brief Bobby's signed affidavit, the USB drive contents, the planning board records showing Greer's involvement in the Ridge Road approval process, and Lena Marsh's bank documentation and statement. Greer's attorney argued the 2019 revised survey was controlling because it was most recent. Tom noted that the county planning office had accepted it based on representations by a surveying firm that had subsequently lost its license for unrelated fraudulent filings in 2 other counties. Tom further noted that the original survey had been on file continuously since 1987 and that no formal petition to alter the property boundary had ever been filed, which was the required process for a legal change of boundary. The judge listened. She asked 7 questions. She read 3 documents herself, holding each one at reading distance with the patience of someone who intended to understand what she was looking at before she said anything about it. Then she ruled. The original 1987 survey was the controlling document. The 2019 revised survey had been filed without a legal boundary amendment petition and therefore had no standing as an alteration of the recorded property line. The Calloway property at 4 Ridgeline Road, Iron Mills, Vermont, consisted of 51.3 acres, as described in the original recording. Any conveyance of a parcel described as 14.2 acres was void, as it did not accurately represent the property to which it referred. The sale agreement Jesse had been about to sign was nullified. The acquisition by Blue Ridge Holdings was subject to a separate fraud investigation to be referred to the Vermont Attorney General's office. Jesse sat at the plaintiff's table and heard the judge say the words and felt something in her chest release that she had not known was still held. It was not the relief of a problem being solved. It was older than that. It was the recognition of a chain completing itself, the feeling of a thing that had been built carefully by a careful man finally arriving at the purpose it was built for. She called her mother from the courthouse steps. Diana picked up on the second ring, which meant she had been waiting. Jesse said, "We won." Her mother was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. Then she said, "Your father knew you would." She said, "He built it so I could." Her mother said, "He built everything so you could." She stood on the courthouse steps with the phone to her ear and the February sky above her doing something complicated between winter and the idea of spring clouds going light at the edges, sun finding the snow in the parking lot, and making it briefly brilliant. Behind her through the glass courthouse doors, she could hear Tom's voice and Wade's voice and Bobby explaining something to a person who had not asked to be explained to. Diana said, is he there, Caleb? She said yes. He drove the 4 hours yesterday and stayed at a motel off the highway. Her mother said, I want to meet him. When I come home, will you arrange that? Jesse said, I will. Diana said, tell him I want to buy him dinner. She paused. Tell him his check cleared and I never said thank you. She laughed. She said, I'll tell him. She went back inside and found the group in the courthouse corridor. Tom was explaining the AG referral timeline. Wade was writing in a small notebook. Bobby was standing with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who felt he had contributed significantly to the outcome. Lena Marsh stood at the edge of the group with the quiet composure of someone who had done the right thing and was still adjusting to what it felt like. Caleb was at the end of the corridor looking at a framed photograph on the wall, a black and white image of the courthouse in 1934 winter, the same steps she had just stood on covered in snow that was 82 years gone. He turned when she came in. She said, we won. He said, I heard. She said, my mother wants to buy you dinner. He said, I will not refuse that. She also said to tell you the check cleared and she never said thank you. He looked at the courthouse photograph for a moment. He said, she does not need to thank me. She said, I know. She wants to anyway. There is a difference. He looked at her. He said, your father said the same thing to me once. He said, there is what people need to do and then there is what they want to do. And the second one is about dignity, not debt. She said, he sounds like he was a lot of things. He said he was. He was a man worth knowing. I am sorry you only got part of the time you deserved with him. She stood in the courthouse corridor and thought about that. She thought about 4 years of being angry at Iron Vale for a death that was not their fault. She thought about the Sunday in July when she watched from the upstairs window and did not open the door. She thought about the grocery list she had almost burned in the fireplace on a January night before a storm committed itself to the world. She said, I wasted some time. He said, you were grieving. Grief takes the time it takes. She said, I know. I'm saying I will not waste more of it. He looked at her with the particular attention of a man hearing something that mattered. He said, what does that mean specifically? She said, it means I want to know who my father was, not from a photograph, from the people who knew him. The stories he would have told me himself if he had had more time, the good ones and the bad ones. She said, it means I would like to not be a stranger to the chapter. I am not asking to join anything. I am just saying the door that has been closed, I would like it to be open. He said, that is something we can do. She said, good. He said, your father is going to be insufferably vindicated about this. She said, he already is. She looked at the courthouse photograph on the wall, the 1934 steps and the 1934 snow, and then back at Caleb. He already was. In the first week of April, Diana Calloway came home. She drove herself from the treatment center, which the doctors had allowed because her last scan had come back the way last scans needed to come back, the numbers moving in the right direction, with a specific momentum that suggested continuation. She arrived in the afternoon when the light was doing what Vermont light did in early April, long and amber, finding the angles of things and making them visible in ways that winter did not allow. Jessie was on the porch. She had been waiting for an hour, not because she knew the exact time, but because the waiting was something she needed to do, needed to feel in its full length so she could mark the before and the after properly. Diana got out of the car and stood in the drive and looked at the house. Her hair was shorter than it had been, and she was thinner in the way treatment made people thinner, but she was standing without help, and her eyes were clear, and she was looking at the house the way people looked at things they had not been sure they would see again. She said, the maples look good. Jessie said Wade in some of the chapter cleared the ice damage from February. Diana said the porch rail. Jessie said Bobby, he has opinions about wood joints. Her mother laughed. She came up the porch steps and stopped in front of Jessie and looked at her daughter for a long moment with the look mothers had when they were measuring how a person had changed. She said, you look like your father. Jessie said, is that good? Diana said, it is the best thing you could be. Inside the house was warm. The kitchen table was set with her mother's good dishes. Not the everyday ones. The good ones, the ones with the blue rim that matched the good mugs. Diana stood in the kitchen doorway and touched the dishes without speaking, running one finger along the rim of the plate she had bought at an estate sale 20 years ago. She looked at the rooster on the sugar bowl. She looked at the reading glasses beside it that were Jessie's now, which happened to be the same simple wire frame as her grandmother's. She said the house feels different. Jessie said it has been lived in differently. Diana said, what does that mean? Jessie thought about how to say it. She said it means it stopped feeling like it was waiting to be taken and started feeling like it was just the house again. Her mother sat down at the table and put her hands flat on the wood and felt the grain of it, the wear and the smoothness, the surface that recorded decades of contact, the way good wood recorded everything. She said, "He built this right." Jesse said he did. They ate dinner together in the kitchen for the first time in 7 months, and afterward, Diana asked about everything, the hearing, and Tom, and the AG referral, and Bobby's testimony, and the chapter. She asked about Lena Marsh and nodded slowly when Jesse described her arriving at the gate with a manila envelope held in both hands. She said, "Good. The people who stayed quiet and then stopped staying quiet matter." She asked about Caleb, not with the wariness of a woman navigating the world her husband had moved in, but with the directness of a woman who had decided she was done managing her own curiosity. Jesse told her. She went back to the night of the blizzard and came forward through the hearing and the weeks in between, and Diana listened the way she had always listened, with her full attention and without interrupting, except to ask the specific question that needed asking at the specific moment. When Jesse was finished, Diana was quiet for a while. She looked at the window, dark now, the April night outside the glass. She said, "Your father picked good people." Jesse said, "He did." Diana said, "He was not always good at telling them so. He said things with his actions better than his words." She paused. "You got the words. You got his ability to say the thing directly. That is valuable. Do not waste it." Jesse said, "I won't." In the third week of May, on a Saturday when the maples were fully out and the back pasture had gone from the pale, uncertain green of early spring to something deeper and more committed, 47 members of Iron Vale MC rode up County Road 12 and came slowly up the drive at Four Ridge Line Road. They did not announce themselves. They had told Caleb they were coming, and Caleb had told Jesse, and she had told her mother, but there was no formal ceremony attached to it. They came because it was the kind of thing the chapter did, and because Ray Calloway had been one of them, and because his daughter had fought for what he left and won, and that was worth marking. They parked along the fence the way they had parked in January, careful with the grass that was new and tender. They came up to the yard gate and stopped there, and Jesse came out to meet them, and they were quiet and respectful in the way of people who understood that this was someone else's place and they were guests. Some of them she had seen during the court proceedings. Some of them she had not met before. Some were men who had known her father for years. A few of the older ones had been at the funeral 4 years ago with their helmets in their hands, the same men she had thanked and then watched leave from an upstairs window. She stood at the gate and she said, "Thank you for coming." They did not make speeches. A few of them said brief things. One of them, a man called Hatch, who was 60 and had ridden with Ray for 9 years, said, "He talked about this place every long run. He said he was going to put a bench by the creek when he retired." "Did he do that?" Jesse said, "He put in the posts. He never put in the seat." Hatch said, "We have lumber in the truck." She looked at him. She said, "You came prepared." He said, "We usually do." She looked at Caleb, who was standing at the edge of the group with Wade and Bobby, 3 men who had spent 4 years carrying something that was not theirs to carry forever and had found the person to hand it to. He looked back at her with an expression she had learned to read over the past months, patient and present, and without any need for this to be other than what it was. She opened the gate. They came in quietly. Some went to the back pasture to put in the bench. Some helped Diana carry plates of food to the long table the neighbors had lent for the day. Some walked the property line, not from any official purpose, but because it was the kind of thing that meant something to walk the land of a man you respected and know where it began and ended, and that it was whole. Bobby sat on the porch with Diana and they talked for 2 hours. She had questions about Ray. She had never been able to ask questions from the years before she met him and the years she thought she knew everything about. Bobby had answers. He was not always gentle with the answers, but he was always honest, which was what she had asked for. Lena Marsh came in the early afternoon, arriving in her small blue car with a container of food from a bakery and the somewhat uncertain posture of someone who was not sure whether she belonged at a gathering she had been invited to. Jesse met her at the gate and said, "You belong here." Lena looked at the yard and the chapter and the table and said, "I am still getting used to being on this side of something." Jesse said, "Me too." They stood together for a moment, watching Bobby hold court from his chair on the porch, telling Diana a story that required both hands to illustrate. Diana was laughing. It was the first time Jesse had heard her mother laugh like that since before the diagnosis. Lena said quietly, "I have been thinking about your father since the hearing. about the fact that he built all of that evidence and filed that document and gave away the key and wrote the letter and then died on the road before any of it was used. She paused. That must have been very lonely, doing all of that careful work and not knowing if it would ever matter. Jessie thought about that. She thought about the gas station phone call to New Hampshire, 40 minutes of careful explanation to a friend who was going to find a legal way to help. She thought about the lockbox and the brass key and the grocery list turned face down in a misc folder in a filing cabinet that smelled like cedar. She said, I think he knew it would matter. He just did not know when or to whom. Lena said, he trusted it to find its way. Jessie said, he trusted the people he gave it to. Jessie walked out to the back pasture in the afternoon and stood beside the bench they had built, set into the ground on cedar posts above the bank of the creek that ran dark and cold below. It was a simple bench plank seat, slightly rough, the kind of thing built by people who were more comfortable with function than appearance, and knew there was nothing wrong with that. She sat on it. The creek was running with purpose, the sound of water that had somewhere to be. The woodlot climbed up to the ridge behind her, 51.3 acres going up to the sky in the full leaf of an early Vermont summer. She thought about her father riding the same road 500 times and building a table and filing a document and making a key and giving it to the right person to hold. She thought about a man who had been careful about things that mattered and who had trusted the chain he built, even when he could not follow it all the way to where it led. Caleb came out across the pasture and sat on the other end of the bench. He did not say anything immediately. She said he never put in the seat. He said he put in the posts. She said, what is the difference? He said the posts are the hard part. Anyone can add the seat once the posts are in. She thought about that. She thought about the table and the fence line and the file at the county clerk's office and the lockbox and the brass key that had lived in a vest pocket for 4 years. She said he put in a lot of posts. Caleb said he did. She said, so did you. He looked at the creek. He said he would have done the same. She said, I know. I am saying thank you anyway. There is a difference. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, your father said the same thing to me once. Almost exactly that. He said, I know you do not need thanks, but I am going to say it anyway because some things want to be said out loud. She said, what did you say when he said that to you? Caleb looked at her. He said, I said, all right then. She said, all right then. They sat on the bench her father had never finished beside the creek that had always been the boundary, and the afternoon light came long through the maples, and the chapter moved around the yard behind them, and Diana's voice carried from the porch, and the season went on, doing its patient work, turning the world green again, the way it did without asking permission, the way things that were built right kept going long after the people who built them were gone. The bench held, the creek ran, the land was whole. Some men left money, some men left names. Ray Calloway left something harder to see and harder to take away. He left a chain of careful things that led eventually through a storm and a locked box and a courthouse in a February morning on a porch to this his daughter sitting in a place that was still hers, knowing finally and completely what he had been and why it mattered and that she was in every way that counted exactly who he had always said she was going to be. Some nights in the weeks that followed, Jessie would come in from the late shift at the diner and the house would be quiet in the particular way it was quiet now, which was different from the way it had been quiet before January. Before January, the quiet had been the quiet of absence of rooms that remembered what they used to hold. Now the quiet had a different quality, settled rather than empty, the way a room felt after people had been in it and left recently traces of warmth in the air, a mug in the drying rack, a book left open on the couch. She would make tea and sit at the table, and sometimes she would read her father's letter, and sometimes she would not because she had reached the point where she could hold it in her mind without needing the paper. She knew the 5 things in the order they were in. She knew the shape of each sentence, the careful block printing the large deliberate letters of a man who had taught himself to be careful about letters because he had not always been. She would sit at the table and think about what he had built and what she was continuing. She had started volunteering at the Burlington Legal Aid Office on alternate Saturdays. She sat across kitchen tables and countertops and once the front seat of a truck in a parking lot because the person she was meeting did not have a private space to talk. She listened. She explained things slowly and in the order they needed to be explained. She told 2 of those people about her own case. She said, I almost burned the document. She said it to show them what almost meant and how close things could come before they turned. Tom said later that she was good at it. She said, I learned from watching people who were good at it. He said, that is usually how it goes. She said, my father learned to build things by watching someone build them. Tom said, and then he built them his way. She said, yes. He said, that is also usually how it goes. There was an evening in late May when Diana came out to the back pasture and sat beside her on the bench. She had been home for 6 weeks by then, and her energy was returning in the incremental way that energy returned after treatment, not all at once, but in accumulating hours, good mornings, giving way to good afternoons to evenings that lasted longer before they tired. Diana sat on the bench and looked at the creek and the woodlot and the ridge above it. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I came here once in the dark, about 2 years after your father died. I could not sleep, and I walked out here in the middle of the night, and I stood in this pasture, and I said out loud, I hope you know I am still here. She paused. I do not know if he heard it, but I said it. Jesse looked at her mother. Diana said, I think he knew. I think he prepared for both possibilities, the one where he was around and the one where he was not, and he trusted the preparation to cover whatever came. Jesse said, he trusted the people he built it with. Diana said, he trusted you specifically. He said Jesse will know what to do with it when the time comes. She said he did not know I was going to almost burn the grocery list. Diana looked at her with the expression she had when something was both serious and slightly funny, the expression Jesse had inherited. She said, he knew you were going to find it. He put it in a folder with things he knew you would go through. Jesse said the MISC folder. Diana said he labeled everything important MISC. He said the best hiding place was the one that looked like nothing. She paused. He used the same principle for the lockbox, a $20 box on a bottom shelf. He said if Greer's people ever came looking, they would not give it a second glance. Jessie sat with that for a moment. She thought about her father designing his own hiding system, his own chain of custody, the deliberate ordinariness of a grocery list and a bottom shelf box and a nickname written in 4 words on the back of a photograph. She said he was very thorough. Diana said, he was. She said it with the completeness of a woman who had known a man long enough to hold both the difficulty and the gift of him in the same breath. He was thorough and he was stubborn, and he made terrible coffee, and he sanded a table for 3 weekends when he could have bought one. She looked at the creek. He was the best person I have known, and I think about him every day. Jessie said, me too. They sat on the bench in the long May evening until the light went gold and the shadows moved east across the pasture, and the chapter of the day that had been beginning things was replaced by the chapter that was simply being in them. The creek ran. The ridge held its light as long as it could. Below them in the yard, the sound of the house settling and Diana's garden beginning its first serious effort of the season. Later, walking back across the pasture together, Diana put her arm through Jessie's, the way she had when Jessie was small, and they were going somewhere that mattered. She said, you know what I think he would say if he could see all of this? Jessie said, tell me. Diana said, he would say, good. That is what he said when things went the way they were supposed to. Not hallelujah, not I told you so, just good. The way you said it when something had been done right and the doing of it was enough. She paused. He would say it, and then he would say, now what? Jessie looked at the house with the porch light coming on in the early dark, the kitchen window lit from inside the porch rail. Bobby had fixed with opinions about the wood joints. She said, now what? Diana said yes. Jessie thought about the Burlington Legal Aid Office on alternate Saturdays. She thought about the 3 cases she was currently helping walk through the process of understanding what they owned and what they were owed and where the documents were that proved it. She thought about Tom saying that careful was the operative word, and about the principle her father had understood that careful work placed in the right location with the right people attached to it had a better chance of being found and used than no work at all. She thought about chains, how they were built, how they were passed, how a new person taking hold did not diminish what came before but continued. It added to it, made the next link. She said, I am going to law school. Diana stopped walking. Jessie said, I have been thinking about it since February. Tom said the Legal Aid Office has a scholarship program for people with direct experience in the cases they handle. He said my father's case would qualify as direct experience. She paused. I am not going to be a lawyer tomorrow. It takes time. But I have been doing math for months about how it does not work out, and I have decided I would rather do math for years about how it eventually does. Diana looked at her daughter in the early dark of the back pasture of the house her husband had built, and the land her father had filed for in 1987, and the bench that had finally gotten its seat. She said he would say good. She said, and then he would say, now what? They walked the rest of the way to the house without talking, which was the kind of silence that was full rather than empty, the kind that meant things had been said that were sufficient, that did not need to be added to immediately because they had landed where they needed to land. Inside the kitchen was warm. The table her father had built was there. The sugar bowl with the ceramic rooster, the lockbox on the shelf above the window, the letter inside it that said 5 things and meant all of them. The house stood. It had always been standing. It had just needed someone to stay, and then someone to go forward, and then someone to come back, and the chain of those things, the staying and the going and the coming back, was the thing her father had understood when he sanded the table and filed the document and wrote the letter and gave away the key. Not that any one person would do it all, that the right people would hold the right pieces until the sequence was ready to complete itself. She had opened the door in a blizzard to men she was afraid of. She had found the paper she almost burned. She had held the key her father left. She had stood on her own porch and watched a man drive away from something he had tried to take. She had done all of it. And the house behind her with its oak table and its ceramic rooster and its photographs and its cedar-smelling back office and its good dishes on the table and her mother's voice carrying from the porch, the house was still standing. It had always been standing. It had just needed someone with her father's jaw and her mother's stubbornness and something of her own that he had recognized but could not name, someone who looked at things straight on and then decided. The posts were in. Someone had put in the seat. The chain held. It had always been going to hold. There was a Sunday in late February, 2 weeks after the hearing, when Jessie drove to the county recorder's office alone. Tom had already done what needed to be done there, but she wanted to see it herself. She wanted to stand in the room where her father had stood on a Wednesday afternoon in March 4 years ago and know that the thing he had filed was still on the shelf where he had placed it. The clerk who helped her was a young man with wire-rimmed glasses who pulled the file without ceremony and set it on the counter. Jessie looked at the stamp. Washington County, Vermont. The date in blue ink, the signature of the deputy clerk who had received it and initialed the bottom of the page. 51.3 acres. Creek bed to the east, ridge line to the north. The lot number her grandfather had been given when he bought the land in 1987. She thought about Ray Calloway standing at this counter. She thought about what he was carrying that afternoon, the knowledge of what Greer had done, the plan he had made carefully and carried out carefully, the drive south on Route 9 that would be the last one. She thought about whether he had paused at this counter the way she was pausing now, whether he had looked at the stamp on the document and felt something give or tighten. She thought he had probably felt both. She said thank you to the young clerk and drove home the long way through Iron Mills proper, past the diner where she worked Tuesday through Saturday, and the school where her mother had spent 18 years keeping the library organized and reading to second graders on Wednesday afternoons, and the county building where Frank Greer had sat on the zoning advisory board and known things about the Ridge Road before the people whose land was affected had been given a chance to know them. She thought about systems. She thought about the way a system that was supposed to protect people could be turned by one person who had learned its edges and pressed them slowly in one direction over years until the edges had moved enough to make room for something that should not have fit. She thought about the fact that her father had used the same system to fight back, had filed a document in a public office, and stamped it with an official seal and put it on a public shelf where anyone who knew to look could find it. She thought about all the people who held small pieces of things without knowing the whole shape, and how sometimes the shape only became visible when enough pieces were in one place at one time. Margaret Sorrells, the deputy clerk who had received the document and logged it and retired without ever knowing why it mattered. Lena Marsh, who had seen something wrong in a bank record and kept copies in the front seat of her car for 2 years and then gotten out of the car. Bobby sitting in a parking lot in 2019 while Ray went into Greer's office alone and coming home with the pale knowledge of what had happened. Wade doing 18 months of property records research with the focused patience of a man who understood that careful work done slowly was more durable than fast work done impressively. Caleb carrying a brass key in a vest pocket for 4 years because a man he had called brother had trusted him to hold it. None of them had known the whole shape. Each of them had held their peace. The shape had only become visible when the storm brought them all to the same table on the same night, and the grocery list was turned over instead of burned. She pulled into the driveway and sat in the truck for a moment before going in. The house looked the way it always looked. From this angle, the porch rail Bobby had reinforced the maple tree on the left that had lost a branch in the February ice storm and been trimmed with a care that was visible in the evenness of the cut, the light in the kitchen window. She thought about 11 days of an envelope on a kitchen table. She thought about the pause on Lena's face in the bank when she looked at the acreage listed in the county records. She thought about the knock at 9:15 and the decision she had made with her hand on the deadbolt, the conscious choice that she could live with because it was a choice and not a reflex. She went inside and made coffee and sat at the oak table and called her mother. Diana answered on the first ring. She said, "How was the drive?" Jesse said, "Good. I went to the recorder's office." Diana said, "I know, you were going to." She said, "It is still there, the document." Her mother was quiet for a moment. She said, "He filed it himself. He told me he was going to Montpelier for a meeting and he would be back for dinner." He was not back for dinner. She paused. "I never knew what he had filed that day until Tom told me at the hearing. I thought it was a routine appointment. He did not tell me because he did not want me to carry it on top of everything else I was already carrying." Jesse said, "He was protecting you." Diana said, "He was always protecting something. The house, me, you, the chapter. Some project that was not finished yet." She said it without bitterness, with the specific warmth of a woman who had been loved by a protective man and had understood both the gift and the cost of it. He could not always tell which things needed to be shared and which things needed to be carried alone. He was not perfect about that. Jesse said, "None of us are." Diana said, "No, but we try." The weeks between the hearing and Diana's return had their own shape, different from the weeks before the blizzard and different from the night of the blizzard itself. Those had been the shape of pressure and crisis and decision. These were the shape of aftermath of a thing that had happened, continuing to settle into the ground it had disturbed. The legal process moved forward with the unhurried institutional pace of processes that did not need to hurry because they had already landed where they needed to land. Tom checked in weekly with brief professional emails that Jessie read carefully and filed in a folder she had labeled in her own handwriting on a paper tab, "Dad's work." Not because Tom was her father's work, but because the folder was the continuation of it. Greer's attorney filed a motion for reconsideration that was denied in 3 weeks. The AG inquiry into Blue Ridge Holdings expanded to include 3 other property transactions in 2 adjacent counties. The surveying firm that had filed the 2019 revision had its state license suspended pending a full audit. Jesse did not follow this part closely because it was the institutional part, the machinery doing what machinery did when someone handed it a clear problem and adequate documentation. She had built enough of the chain. Other hands could carry the rest. The property-secured line of credit closed in mid-February. The hospital balance was settled with a payment and a negotiated reduction in the remaining portion that Tom's medical debt advocacy contact had secured with the practiced ease of someone who did this work because she believed it mattered. Jessie sat at the oak table on the evening after the closing and looked at the numbers on the account statement and felt something she had not felt since the envelope arrived, which was that the math was working in a direction she could live with. She called Bobby to tell him. He said good, and then asked her how the porch rail was holding up because he had opinions about the fasteners he had used. She said the porch rail was fine. He said probably fine is not the same as certainly fine. She said come back in the spring and check it. He said he would put it on the calendar. She called Wade to tell him. He said your father would be satisfied, which she understood to be the highest available expression of approval in Wade's emotional vocabulary. She called Caleb last. He picked up after 2 rings. She said the closing went through. He said good. She said all of it. The credit line, the hospital, the injunction is permanent pending the AG resolution. He said, I know. Tom sent a summary. She said, you have been in contact with Tom. He said, Tom sends updates to everyone involved. She said, I did not know that. He said, you were busy. He said it without any weight behind it, just as information. She said, I want to know things going forward. He said, then I will tell you things going forward. There was a particular Tuesday evening in early March when Jessie was closing up the diner after a long shift, and the other waitress, a woman named Carla, who had been working the same stretch for 12 years and knew everyone in Iron Mills by order, and by name asked her what was going on with the property situation. Jesse dried a glass and set it on the shelf and said, "We won." Carla said, "I heard something about motorcycles at your place." Jesse said 47 of them in May, more before that. Carla considered this. She said, "Your father's people." Jesse said, "My father's people. And mine now." Carla set down the tray she was holding. She looked at Jesse with the direct assessment of a woman who had been watching people for 12 years across a counter and had learned to distinguish between the things people said and the things they meant. She said, "You are different since January." Jesse said, "I opened a door." Carla said, "What was on the other side?" Jesse thought about it. She said, "Everything my father left." There was a night in late March when Jesse could not sleep, and she went down to the kitchen and sat at the table with the lights low and read her father's letter again. She had read it many times by then. Each reading gave her something different, the way certain things did when you brought a different version of yourself to them. The first time she had read it in a cold office doorway at 1 in the morning, and the shape of the words had been enormous. Subsequent readings had been quieter, more specific. She had started to hear her father's voice in the careful block printing the particular rhythm of a man who thought in complete thoughts and wrote them down the same way. The fifth thing in the letter was the one she came back to most often. He had written, "I love you. I have always loved you. Even when you were looking out the window, when the chapter came by on that Sunday in July, and you thought I did not know you were watching. I knew. You look at things the way your grandmother looked at things. Straight on, and then you decide." She thought about the Sunday in July. She had been 20 home for a weekend visit, still raw from the funeral. Two men had come to the door, and she had gone upstairs and watched from the window until they left. She had not told her father. She had not thought he knew. He had known. Of course he had known. He had built a table and paid attention to the grain of the wood. He was the kind of man who noticed the things that were not said as clearly as the things that were. She thought about what it meant that he had known and had not said anything. He had not confronted her about it, not written about it in the letter with any judgment, just noted it as a thing he had observed, a thing that told him something true about her. He had been giving her time to decide. She sat at the table in the quiet house with his letter in her hands and the ceramic rooster on the sugar bowl and the window dark with the end of March outside it, and she thought quietly and without ceremony that she had decided. She folded the letter and put it back in the lockbox, which now lived on the shelf above the kitchen window where she could see it from the table. She went back to bed. She slept well for the first time in a week. Jesse began volunteering at the Burlington Legal Aid Office on alternate Saturdays, driving up from Iron Mills in the early morning and spending 4 or 5 hours in meetings with people who were in the middle of the kind of situation she had been in 6 months ago and did not yet know that there was a way through. She sat across kitchen tables and countertops and once the front seat of a truck in a parking lot because the person she was meeting did not have a private space to talk. She listened. She explained things slowly and in the order that they needed to be explained and without making people feel like they should have already known them. She told 2 of those people about her own case. She said, "I almost burned the document." She said it to show them what almost meant and how close things could come before they turned. Both times the person across from her looked at her with the specific recognition of someone hearing something that was also true about their own situation, the sense that the thing they had nearly lost was not gone yet. Tom said later that she was good at it. She said, "I learned from watching people who were good at it." He said, "That is usually how it goes." She said, "My father learned to build things by watching someone build them." Tom said, "And then he built them his way." She said, "Yes." He said, "That is also usually how it goes." On the last Saturday in April, 3 days before Diana came home, Jesse went out to the back pasture in the evening. The creek was up from the snowmelt running loud against its banks with the specific urgency of water that had been held back by ice for months and had things to get to. The woodlot above was coming into bud the particular pale green of maple leaves before they committed to their full color lit from behind by the declining sun. She stood at the bench for a while without sitting. She thought about 47 motorcycles parked along the fence line. She thought about Hatch saying he talked about this place every long run and the lumber already in the truck before they arrived. She thought about all the things her father had talked about and never gotten to. The bench he had set posts for and never finished. The letter he had written longhand on yellow legal pad paper because if he typed it, he would edit out the parts that needed to be there. The conversation with his daughter that had never happened. She thought about what it meant to leave things unfinished and trust that someone would finish them. She sat down on the bench. The seat was solid. The post went into the ground the way her father's posts always went deep enough to matter. The creek ran below her. The woodlot climbed behind her. The sky above the ridge was the color of the last hour before dark, not quite gold, not quite gray, the specific in-between color of days that were extending themselves into more daylight than they had had a month before. She thought about trust. She thought about it as a structural thing, the way posts were structural, the way a county filing was structural, the way a key given to a friend was structural. Not the feeling of trust, though that mattered too, but the architecture of it, the deliberate choice to build something in a way that would stand after you were gone and allow other people to continue what you had started. Her father had not been certain she would find the grocery list. He had not been certain Caleb would find her at the right moment. He had not been certain the county clerk would still have the document 4 years later. He had not been certain about any of the specific pieces, but he had understood the principle, which was that careful work placed in the right location with the right people attached to it had a better chance of being found and used than no work at all. He had built the chain the way he built the table, not because he was certain it would work, but because it was the best he could do with what he had and the time available to him. She had almost burned the grocery list, but she had not. She sat on the bench until the light was nearly gone, and the creek was a sound more than a shape in the dark below her. Then she walked back across the pasture through the tall grass that was coming in thick after the wet spring through the yard gate, up the back porch steps, and into the kitchen. The light was on. The table was there. The sugar bowl with the ceramic rooster was there. The lockbox was on the shelf above the window. She made tea and sat down and held her father in her mind, the way she had learned to hold him not as absence, but as presence, not as the man who was gone, but as the man who had built the table and filed the document and given away the key and loved her even when he did not know how to say so. The man who had recognized something in her that he had called by the name of his own best quality, careful, and had trusted that quality to carry what he had started to the place where it was supposed to go. She thought the house sounded different now. Not louder or quieter, just different. The way a room sounded different when it had been used recently, after a long emptiness, the walls remembering what they were for. She rinsed her mug and set it in the drying rack and went to bed. She slept well.